Hey everyone, I just spent the last couple of months reading through all the Song of Ice and Fire novels and their prequel novellas by George R.R. Martin, and I thought I'd collect all the reviews in one handy video. But since I don't feel like just recycling content, I've gone and individually reviewed each of the novellas too. Though keep in mind the Archmaester Glydane histories are the expanded versions published in Fire and Blood, rather than the original editions published in short story anthologies over the years. The reviews will be in chronological order, and we'll cap it off with a ranking at the end. Let's get to it. Hey everyone, I just read Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin with illustrations by Doug Wheatley, and for the most part it was a chore. At least House of the Dragon won't want for material. It's a fictional text by Archmaester Glydane of the Citadel recording the history of Westeros under the rule of the Targaryen kings from Aegon the Conqueror to Aegon III. The prose? The Dance of Dragons was a great story with many shocking twists and turns and many interesting characters, and I really enjoyed how different sources gave different versions of the events recounted during it. The conquests of Aegon I and his sisters were great to read about too, not just because it gives us a glimpse at the state of Westeros before the Targaryens conquered it, but because of the bitter wars between the newly forged Seven Kingdoms and Dorne. And the illustrations were fantastic. The battle scenes were really well depicted, but I also liked how Doug Wheatley was able to portray the same characters at different ages or different physical conditions without making them unrecognisable to each other, such as with Jaehaerys and Aegon II. The cons? Most of the rule of Jaehaerys the Conciliator was pretty boring. There were some parts I liked, like the supposed circumnavigation of the globe by the Sun Chaser, and some characters I enjoyed like Jonquil Dark, but we didn't need 200 pages of intricate detail about what was, in essence, 55 years of peaceful rule. It was really hard to keep track of so many characters over such a huge period. It was doable in the main books because there they were actual characters with personalities, but the vast majority of the cast here are just names with maybe one or two actions attributed to them. And that brings me to my final point. This book is just so stale. It's just an outline written in the style of a history book, and for a fiction novel that style of writing just isn't engaging. For a real-world non-fiction history book, I would be more forgiving of this, given the events actually happened, and in some way give context to the way the world is today. But Fire and Blood is about a place that doesn't exist, describing events that didn't happen, and I just don't have the patience for that, especially given its length. Much as I enjoyed the Dance of Dragons and hope House of the Dragon does its potential justice, I would have much preferred the pages and effort that went into this book to have gone into the Winds of Winter instead. This is a book I'd only recommend to the biggest Song of Ice and Fire fans. If you're curious about how House of the Dragon might play out, just read from Heirs of the Dragon, A Question of Succession, to Aftermath, The Hour of the Wolf, and you'll be covered. The rest of it isn't worth it in my opinion. This is the only work of Martin's I've ever actively disliked, and I'm giving Fire and Blood a C. Sorry, it would have been a D if not for the Dance of Dragons. Hey everyone, I just read The Sons of the Dragon, first published in the Book of Swords, edited by Gardner Dozois, and later expanded in Fire and Blood, and it was alright. It certainly is an outline. It's a novella about the life and reign of the two kings to rule Westeros after Aegon the Conqueror conquered it, his sons Aenys and Maegor. The prose? It was interesting to learn how the Faith Militant were originally put down by Maegor the Cruel, before their sudden return almost 300 years later in A Feast for Crows, and the conflict between the Faith of the Seven and the Targaryens regarding their marriage customs felt pretty believable. The dichotomy between Aenys and Maegor was really interesting, how they were both strong and weak in their own ways, how they both responded to the Faith of the Seven in their own ways. There was more depth to them as characters than a lot of the people who show up in these stories. And I liked the conflict between Maegor and Aenys' son Aegon the Uncrowned, short though it was. The cons? Maegor, once he comes to power, just becomes a very stereotypical evil overlord who ends up stabbed to death on his own throne, which is fine for a vague reference in the book set centuries later, but I was expecting something a bit more complex from a more detailed look at his rule as presented here. It was hard to keep track of everyone outside the Targaryen family given most of the characters are just a name with one or two things to do. And this style of writing works well for real-world non-fiction history books, but I really didn't enjoy it here. It's fine, but I wouldn't recommend it unless you're a big Song of Ice and Fire fan. If not, I think you can give it a skip. You won't miss anything. And I'm giving The Sons of the Dragon a C. Hey everyone, I just read The Rogue Prince, first published in Rogues, edited by Gardner Dozois and George R.R. Martin, and later expanded in Fire and Blood. And it was good. I enjoyed it. It's a novella about King Viserys' problem younger brother Prince Daemon, the black sheep of the Targaryen family, and his misadventures while living in the shadow of the crown. The prose? Prince Daemon might be an awful person, but he was a lot of fun to read about, and his force of personality shined even through the stale historical style of writing. There were some great shocking moments here that set up even more shocking moments to come in the Dance of Dragons, and on that note, the events here do a good job of setting the board for the coming war, with factions sprouting between the two rival branches of House Targaryen, held together only by the will of King Viserys. The cons? This novella is just a prologue for a much more interesting story not contained within its pages. It's fine if you're reading it in Fire and Blood, but on its own the ending might feel a bit abrupt. It was hard to keep track of so many characters when most of them were just names devoid of the personalities you'd normally find in a fictional work, especially from this series. And the style of historical writing used to tell this story just isn't engaging to me, it's boring. That said, this was a decent read, and it gives a lot of necessary context to the following novella, making it much better for it. I'd give it a recommend if you're curious as to how House of the Dragon might play out, given this novella seems to be where that show is going to start, or if you're a massive fan of A Song of Ice and Fire. Otherwise, I think you can give it an easy skip, and I'm giving The Rogue Prince a B. Hey everyone, I just read The Princess and the Queen, first published in Dangerous Women, edited by Gardner Dozois and George R.R. Martin, and later expanded in Fire and Blood, and it was great. It might only be a rough outline, but it was an engaging outline. It's a novella about the conflict called the Dance of Dragons, where two rival branches of House Targaryen went to war over the issue of succession, and tore the Seven Kingdoms to shreds in the process. The pros? This conflict is as grand, complex, and morally grey as the War of the Five Kings from the main series. It is a fascinating war, and all of that comes through, even through the stuffy style of writing used here. I really enjoyed how the various primary sources used by the in-universe historian recounting the tale don't agree on how things happened, and this is a side note, but it'll be interesting to see what version of events the TV show goes with in telling a less ambiguous account of the war. And this is a war filled with twists and turns, some epic like the Battle of Rook's Rest, some small like Blood and Cheese, but all of them were great and engaging. The cons? In many ways, the Dance of Dragons is just the War of the Five Kings with dragons. There are differences, but the inciting incident is still about the legitimacy of a queen's children. There's a character who is very much like the High Sparrow who shows up towards the end. I know that history repeats in real life, but in fiction this just feels like the War of the Five Kings again, with some of the variables switched around, though overall this is a nitpick. I really didn't enjoy the style of stuffy historical writing used for this novella. I don't mind it in non-fiction, but I can't stand it in fiction, and I would have much preferred to read this story in the style of the main Song and Ice and Fire books, impossible as I know that would be, rather than the distant outline that it is here. And this novella ends before the conflict is over, which is very frustrating if you're not reading the expanded version published in Fire and Blood. This has the potential to be a fantastic TV series. I really hope House of the Dragon is able to live up to that and inject the depth and complexity of character that this novella is sorely lacking when it comes out in a few months at the time of uploading. For that reason, if you're curious about the show, I'd suggest you give this novella a read. I'd even recommend it to fans of the series overall, and to fans of fantasy in general, because it's a great story with the potential to be even greater, and I'm giving The Princess and the Queen a high B. It's so close to a low A, but it's just not quite there. Hey everyone, I just read The Hedge Knight, the first of the 3 novellas collected in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, and it was really good. Crazy just how many Targaryens there were running around only 100 years before A Game of Thrones. What happened to them all? It's a novella about a young hedge knight named Dunk and his squire, a small boy named Egg, competing in a jousting tournament, before unwittingly coming to the attention of some very powerful people. The pros? After reading through the Song of Ice and Fire books, it was great to have a story set in the same universe that is much smaller in scale and scope. It was a real breath of fresh air. I really enjoyed getting to see the Targaryens in their prime and how different they all were from each other, how some were genuinely good people like Baelor Breakspear, some were awful like Aerion Brightflame, and others were in between like Prince Maekar. It was a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed how it told a whole and complete story. It was great to have some closure, tragic though the ending was. The cons? These are all going to be nitpicks because I really enjoyed this one, but for a series and a writer known for their complex female characters, this story didn't really feature any other than Tansel, who just leaves halfway through. After all the build-up, I sort of wish we'd got to see more of the tournament, and despite everything that happens, it still feels weird that Prince Maekar would just allow his son to travel off with some random hedge knight at the end of the story. These stories are far less bleak than the main books, but this still felt a little too romantic for me. All that aside, this was a great story, and I'd easily recommend it to fans of fantasy and the other Song of Ice and Fire books if you haven't checked it out already, and I'm giving The Hedge Knight an S. Hey everyone, I just read The Sworn Sword, the second novella collected in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, and it was really good. Finally, a good story set in Dawn. It's a novella about a dispute between an old landed knight and a young widowed woman regarding their respective lands, and a certain hedge knight and his boy squire caught between the two. The pros? The way the plot unravels its layers of complexity, with Dunk at first standing up for the apparent underdog Sir Eustace, then getting to know the other side of the conflict with Lady Rohan, and going back and forth between them, was really interesting. I really enjoyed it. It was great to learn more about the original Blackfire Rebellion, since it's so distant by the time of the main books, and Lady Rohan was an interesting character. I liked how she came off as being independent, despite also being constrained by the patriarchal culture of the Seven Kingdoms. The cons? The resolution of this story felt so rushed. It all happens off-page, and just seems so neat and tidy given all that happened before it, but whatever. The story leaves a couple of things unresolved, like Sir Bennis the Menace, which just seems like fodder for future stories that will never be written. And this story could be considered necessary reading for A Song of Ice and Fire, given how much context it gives to a lot of the backstory that is only hinted at in the main books. It wasn't as good as the Hedge Knight, but it was still pretty good, and I enjoyed it. This is an easy recommend if you're a fan of Martin's other work and want more, and I'm giving The Sworn Sword an A. Hey everyone, I just read The Mystery Knight, the third and final novella of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, and it was great. It's good to know that Walder Frey was a soggy dumpster even when he was a child. It's a novella about a tall knight and his boy squire attending a tourney at a wedding, unaware they're walking into a nest of bitter rebellion. The prose? It might be a novella, but it packs a bunch of great twists and turns into its short runtime. I was really engaged. I really enjoyed the characters in this one, John the Fiddler especially for how tragic he is, and it was great to see the Blood Raven in his prime. He's such an important character to A Song of Ice and Fire, but he comes at the reader like a slap for how often he's mentioned in the main books. It was nice to get a bit more context for him here. The cons? Because of that context, this novella is necessary reading for the main 5 books too. Once again, this story was lacking in any interesting female characters that the series is generally known for, and in many ways this story is just a rehash of the Hedge Knight in terms of plot and pacing, though there's enough difference in tone that it really is just a nitpick, honestly. This was a great story. It might be a reprise of the Hedge Knight like I mentioned, but it is a beautifully dark one, and it's worth a read if you're a fan of the series and haven't checked it out yet. And I'm giving The Mystery Knight an S. Hey everyone, I just read A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms by George R.R. Martin with illustrations by Gary Gianni, and it was great. The only problem is I want more. It's a collection of free novellas about a young knight called Dunk and his boy squire Egg, who is secretly a royal prince as they travel the Seven Kingdoms fighting in tourneys and serving as soldiers to lords all across the continent. The prose? This is a prequel in the best way, set far enough back that it doesn't have to rigidly adhere to established canon, but not so far back that the world is unrecognisably different from the one presented in the 5 main books. The same is true of the lighter tone and various characters too. It was great. Dunk and Egg were a great pair of protagonists. It was lovely to see the world through Dunk's eyes, and I especially liked how while Egg is smart and resourceful, he's still a kid and he acts like it sometimes. And I loved the looming legacy of the Blackfire Rebellion over the Sworn Sword and the Mystery Knight. It's a fascinating conflict, and it was great to hear about it in greater depth here than in the main series, since it happened only 16 years ago at the time of the novellas. The cons? A Song of Ice and Fire is well known for its complex female characters, but the Dunk and Egg novellas mostly only feature men, though Lady Rohan is an exception, and overall this is a nitpick. I love the illustrations, and if I could add them as a 4th pro I would, but the one thing that did annoy me about them is that they sometimes would be placed out of step with the prose they were depicting, though once again this is a nitpick. And with the growing importance of the Blood Raven over the course of the last 2 novellas, and the series at large, this collection is necessary reading for A Song of Ice and Fire overall. But again, this is a nitpick. I really love these novellas. I'd easily recommend them to fans of the main series, but also to fans of fantasy who want something good that isn't too bleak or too long, and I'm giving A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms an S. Hey everyone, I just read A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin, and it was fantastic. Given how poorly the TV adaptation ended, it's easy to forget just how breathtaking the original story was, and still is. It's a book about... oh goodness, where do I start? It's a book about a noble lord who takes the office of the king's right hand in order to investigate the mysterious death of his predecessor, while the king plots to have the children of his own predecessor, currently in exile across the sea, killed to remove their claim on the throne. You already know why we're here. The prose? The world of this series is so vividly realised it almost feels real. From history to culture to places to magic, all of it feels like it's built upon a foundation of several thousand years, rather than having sprung up suddenly for the sake of the story like a lot of fantasy worlds tend to feel. The characters are just as deep. Whether they are narrators or not, every character felt distinct in voice, and even better, all of them felt like human beings with flaws and virtues. And this book is brutally realistic when it comes to exploring many standard fantasy tropes. It does not pull its punches. The cons? The first 100 pages or so of the book feel like they were written years apart from the rest of the novel before the full story was planned out. There are a lot of weird things that never come up again, like Tyrion being an acrobat that keep the story from meshing together as well as it could. Being a brutal depiction of reality and what life may have been like in the Middle Ages, this book does not shy away from things like child marriages and all that phrase entails, which I found to be pretty uncomfortable reading. And I really did not enjoy the Bran chapters. They're not poorly written, and given how the TV show ended, I understand the focus he gets, but he's just not an interesting character, and his chapters were mostly pretty boring in my opinion. Overall, this was a fantastic read. I'd easily give it a recommend to fans of dark fantasy, especially to anyone who was disillusioned by how the TV show ended, and appropriately enough, I'm giving a Game of Thrones an A. Hey everyone, I just read A Clash of Kings by George R.R. Martin and it was pretty good, but I also don't like it. I wish I could tell you why, but I myself don't know the answer. It's a book about a massive continent-spanning war between 5 kings, 3 claiming the Iron Throne, 2 fighting for independence, while in the far north a 6th king gathers an army for reasons unknown, and in the east a newly made queen searches for ships and men to sail them as the world gazes in awe of her newly hatched dragons. The prose? Everything that was great about the first book is still great here. The world feels massive and detailed and real, as do the thousands upon thousands of characters who appear. It's very impressive. The sections of the book focusing on the war, particularly the three-way conflict between King Joffrey and King's Landing, King Stannis on Dragonstone, and King Renly at Storm's End, carried the novel, and the way it culminates in the Battle of Blackwater Bay was just the cherry on top. And the new focus on the factions in the Stormlands, the Iron Islands and Dragonstone all added interesting facets to the world and characters. The cons? That said, it is at the expense of previously established factions. The war plot consumes so much of the novel that quite a few other important plot threads just get pushed to the wayside, such as the Great Ranging Beyond the Wall, King Robb's war in the Riverlands, and especially Queen Daenerys' stay in Karth. No wonder the show had trouble making anything of them in the second season. A lot of chapters here spend a lot of time building atmosphere and character without advancing much plot, such as the chapter where Jon Snow finds a cache of obsidian daggers, but then suddenly you'll get a chapter where something happens so quickly it feels like there was none of the careful build-up present in the rest of the book, like when Arya helps the Northmen take Harrenhal out of nowhere in the space of 2 pages. The pacing, especially in the first half of the book, is all over the place, and it really doesn't help that on average the chapters are getting much longer. And I still don't like Bran. All of his chapters are just exposition dumps for things I wish I'd actually read happening elsewhere in the North. I'm still not entirely sure why I don't like this book despite the fact that it's great, but there you go. If you enjoyed A Game of Thrones, you'll probably enjoy this one, though I wouldn't recommend it on its own. And I'm giving A Clash of Kings an A. Yeah, it's still so good that even though I don't like it, it still gets an A. I don't understand either. Hey everyone, I just read A Storm of Swords by George R.R. Martin, and this is the series at its best, which is both a good and a bad thing. It's a book about the ongoing war of 5 kings for the Iron Throne of Westeros, while beyond the wall a 6th king marches on the south, and across the sea a certain dragon queen takes it upon herself to liberate the slaves of Slaver's Bay, by any means necessary. The prose? The plot gets a real kick in the rear here. Things move along quickly and focus is spread across all the plots rather than King's Landing hogging the spotlight again. Daenerys' plot was a serious return to form. Slaver's Bay is a much more interesting place than Karth, and she is much more active and focused in achieving her goals than she was in the last book. And this book has some great twists and turns that not only recontextualise the earlier novels, but bring the story started in A Game of Thrones to a satisfying conclusion. Some are big like the Red Wedding, some are small like Jaime Lannister's Inner Turmoil, but all of them are great. The cons? That said, this book goes out of its way to resolve so many of the plot threads from the first 3 books that it leaves very little that's familiar for later books to actually focus on. This book is very long and very bleak, which wasn't a problem for me, but it's something to consider. And if any of the plots got left behind, it's the stuff on Dragonstone with Davos, King Stannis and Melisandre. Very little actually happens until the very end, and most of it was just spent with Davos getting thrown in and out of the dungeons for one thing or another. No wonder the show struggled with the plot there. This is easily my favourite of the series. It's very long and has about 5 separate climaxes, but somehow it all works. It's a great conclusion to the first half of the series. In fact, you could read the first 3 books as their own standalone trilogy. The story resolves itself so well here, and I can't recommend it enough. And, appropriately, I'm giving A Storm of Swords an S. Hey everyone, I just read A Feast for Crows by George R.R. Martin, and it wasn't what I wanted, but it was still pretty damn good. It was only while reading this book again that I realised I'd been misreading Kettle Black as Kettle Back for the past 11 years. Thanks, brain. It's a book about the 7 kingdoms in turmoil in the aftermath of the War of 5 Kings, with most people just trying to pick up the pieces and get on with life, while the lords and ladies continue to play their Game of Thrones, for better or worse. The prose? It was great to see Braavos. Arya and Samwell's chapters there were definite highlights. The plot concerning the aftermath of the war in King's Landing in the Riverlands was really compelling, and it was very satisfying to have Cersei's plans finally blow up in her face. and the political conflict in the Iron Islands helped not only add a little urgency to the pacing once the King Moot was done, but also introduced a bunch of interesting characters and viewpoints like Euron, Victarion, and Asher. The cons? I understand the reasons why Martin split this book and Dance with Dragons in two, but the absence of point of view characters like Jon Snow, Daenerys, and Tyrion Lannister was really noticeable here, and it definitely hurt the pacing overall. This book gets lost in the source more than any other previous entry in the series. Many chapters, especially early on, are so focused on describing the atmosphere and minutiae of a scene that very little plot actually happens. The first few hundred pages were a real slog. And Dawn was really disappointing. I know it's a meme to dunk on the TV show's treatment of Dawn, and it's not a terrible plot in abstract here, but the execution is so messy. It's definitely the weakest of the series overall, but there's still a lot to love about this book, and hey, at least there's no Bran. So for that reason alone, I'm giving A Feast for Crows an S out of 10. Just kidding, it's getting an A. Hey everyone, I just read A Dance with Dragons by George R.R. Martin, and it was great, but it was also very bittersweet. It's a book about an exiled dragon queen trying and failing to hold her conquered cities in the east from collapsing into war, while conspiracies plan to bring her home or replace her with a better option. And meanwhile, back in her homeland, several factions vie for control of the north, as winter looms and the dead rise to make a joke at the Game of Thrones the lords and ladies continue to play. The pros? The book gives a much greater focus on the cities and cultures of Essos, and it was really interesting to see more of this world beyond the Seven Kingdoms, especially the state of Slaver's Bay after Daenerys' arrival. The whole escalation of plot and tone in this book was perfect. The way all the plot threads start coming together in Essos in the north beneath the looming threat of winter, it was almost like a horror story with the way things kept getting worse and worse and worse for everyone. And while it was fantastic to have Jon, Daenerys, and especially Tyrion back as viewpoint characters after Feast, I really enjoyed the more minor viewpoints too, like Quentyn, Theon, John Connington, poor old Kevin, and especially Barristan Selmy. The book would be lesser without them. The cons? Much as I love the focus on Essos, quite a bit of it feels like it's just being exotic for the sake of exoticism, such as how the people of Slaver's Bay consider dog to be a delicacy, and all their names have a Z. It just felt like a bit of a caricature of the medieval Near East at times compared to the more clearly defined European influence of Westeros and Braavos. As befits the tone, this book is probably the bleakest of the entire series, especially in Quentyn, Theon and Asher's chapters, and even for me, it was too much sometimes. And this book ends at the worst possible moment. For all its faults, A Feast for Crows actually resolved many of its plot threads, what with Cersei scheming herself into a cell, Jaime finally giving up on her and Samwell finally making it to Old Town, but practically every plot thread started in Dance and all those continued from Feast, end with a massive cliffhanger, and it is very frustrating not to have any sort of resolution even over a decade later. I would be lying if I said I'm not disappointed The Winds of Winter still isn't out, but I've made my peace with it, and if this book is to be the last release volume of A Song of Ice and Fire, I think it ends on a high, if frustratingly bittersweet note. I can't recommend this book on its own, but I also can't recommend this series enough, and I'd say this book is worth a read if you've only ever watched the show, just to see how great a difference there is between the two. And I'm giving A Dance with Dragons an A. And just to round it out, hey everyone, I just read all of A Song of Ice and Fire and its prequels by George R.R. Martin, and it was fantastic, if very frustrating at times. There really is very little else like it in fiction at the moment. It's a series about the Seven Kingdoms of Westeros and a dynasty of dragon riders who come to conquer and rule the continent over a 300-year period, until their sudden destruction and exile, right on the cusp of a supernatural invasion of dead things from the north in the wake of a terrible and grueling war. The pros? The characters here are so complex and well realised, they feel like real people, even those presented at a distance through Fire and Blood's history. The sense of depth to the world building is colossal, whether writing in the present day setting of the main books or historical periods of the Duncan Egg novellas, or even earlier in Fire and Blood, everything here feels naturally connected. Even in the very first book, it never felt like the world sprung up from nothing for the sake of the story. And this series isn't afraid to take risks with its twists and turns. It's a story that keeps you on your toes, even in the history books. The cons? Martin tends to get lost in the details when writing, which can drag at times, be it in A Clash of Kings or A Feast for Crows, or in the fictional history with the unending nadir that was the rule of Jaehaerys the Conciliator. The events described in this series can get so bleak at times that it can be hard to care about what happens next. And perhaps the biggest problem with this series is that it isn't finished. In fact, no aspect of it is, be it the Ice and Fire books, the Duncan Egg novellas, or even the fictional history started in Fire and Blood. Like I said when reviewing A Dance with Dragons, I've made my peace with that, and if A Song of Ice and Fire is destined to remain an unfinished masterpiece, it's still a masterpiece. The books can be long and bleak, but if you can get over that, I think it's still a great series as it is, and I'd recommend it if you're a fan of fantasy of any kind. Epic, dark, low, whatever you like, and I'm giving A Song of Ice and Fire an A. And there we are, every Song of Ice and Fire story reviewed, and here they are ranked. I hope you enjoyed the video. It's been fun getting to reread these books and get to the parts of the series that I'd never looked at before, like the Dunk and Egg stories. I'm always looking for reading suggestions, so if you've got one, post it in a comment down below. If you liked the video and want to see more, I'd really appreciate a subscription, and share it around. No doubt it'll make someone angry. Thank you so much for watching. Bye everyone.